April 30th, 1945, Berlin burns. The city that once stood as the heart of the Third Reich now lies in ruins. Streets choked with smoke, the night sky flickering orange under relentless Allied bombardment. Deep beneath the chaos, Adolf Hitler retreats into his concrete bunker, surrounded by loyalists, maps that no longer matter, and the ghost of a war already lost. But somewhere above the crumbling capital, a signal cuts through the static. At 2:37 a.m., across Europe's darkened skies, Allied listening stations pick up something faint, a voice distorted, almost drowned in the crackle of interference, inside a dimly lit communications room in London. A young American codebreaker leans forward, his headphones pressed tight. "Hold on," he whispers. "Rewind that frequency." Again, the voice repeats, fragmented through the noise. German, then English. A rasp heavy with exhaustion, yet unmistakably familiar. It can't be. It sounds like him. The operators exchange stunned glances. The message is short, less than 20 seconds. A few broken sentences. Then silence. Within the hour, the order comes down from Washington. Cease all playback. This transmission did not occur, but it did. And those who heard it would never forget the final words buried in the static, a chilling promise whispered through the dying airwaves of a collapsing empire. When the silence ends, my voice will return, the signal vanishes. The war grinds toward its bloody conclusion, and for nearly 80 years, the world will never know what was really transmitted that night, or who exactly was speaking. Berlin. April 1945. The city that once symbolized Hitler's invincible empire now resembles the grave of his dreams. The Reich Chancellery stands surrounded by smoldering ruins, its marble corridors echoing with the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. Outside, the air reeks of ash and desperation. Inside, paranoia festers. In the Führer bunker, the walls tremble as bombs strike nearby. Maps litter the table. Front lines crossed out, territories gone. Round the table stand men who once commanded millions. Goebbels, Bormann, Himmler, faces pale, eyes sunken. They argue not about victory, but about survival. Himmler insists on negotiation. Goebbels calls it treason. Hitler slams his fist against the table, shouting hoarsely that the German people have failed him. His voice, once commanding, now cracks under the weight of madness. Above ground, Berlin is a city of ghosts. Women and children huddle in basements as shells tear through the night. The once proud Luftwaffe is grounded, fuel gone, pilots dead. In every corner, whispers spread that the end has come, that the Führer will not leave the city alive. Yet amid the chaos, one ministry still functions, the Reich Propaganda Ministry. Inside a bunker on Wilhelmstrasse, technicians work feverishly under the orders of Joseph Goebbels. Their mission, to record and preserve Hitler's final message to the German nation, a speech meant to outlive defeat, a voice for eternity. The equipment hums as engineers load reels of magnetic tape. The power flickers. Outside, Soviet artillery creeps closer with every passing hour. In London, Allied codebreakers monitor the German airwaves, expecting the usual desperate communications, commands to retreat, calls for surrender. But then a strange frequency appears. It's faint, erratic, slipping in and out of detection. The operators note something unusual. It isn't transmitted from the known government frequencies. Instead, it originates from a signal hub believed destroyed days earlier in the bombing of Potsdam. In Virginia, at a remote U.S. Signal Corps facility, analysts received the same anomaly. The waveform doesn't match standard German encoding. The message is brief, indecipherable phrases, bursts of static, a tone that seems to modulate unnaturally, almost alive. The analysts suspect interference, perhaps Soviet jamming. But then a technician isolates the audio. Beneath the distortion, he swears he hears a voice. The report reaches London within hours. Unidentified transmission from Berlin sector. Unknown origin. Possible Reich broadcast. Recommend monitoring. Back in Berlin, Goebbels watches the recording equipment struggle to stay powered. Sweat beads on his forehead as he dictates the script. words of defiance, of immortality, of a Germany that will rise again. Hitler sits slumped, hands trembling. His speech falters, wandering from rage to delusion, from vengeance to prophecy. The technicians exchange glances. The man before them no longer sounds human. By midnight, the Soviet tanks are less than a mile away. The recording is completed, or so they think. But something strange happens. The operator swears the machine continues spinning, even after the tape ends, the dials moving on their own. A faint pulse flickers on the transmitter, as if another signal had taken control. Moments later, the building shakes. The power cuts out. The engineers flee. But somewhere, deep within the radio circuits of a dying empire, a single transmission escapes. It travels through the chaos, across burning fields, through clouds heavy with ash, bouncing off Allied listening posts and across the Atlantic. Those who heard it that night would later describe it as unnatural. A voice beneath the voice, a message buried inside the message. And though the propaganda ministry would fall within hours, the strange signal would not disappear. In fact, it would soon become the most closely guarded secret of the war's end, a transmission that shouldn't exist. Sent from a city already dead. The rain fell in sheets over the listening post in southern England, beating against the metal roof like distant gunfire. Inside, a row of exhausted operators sat hunched over flickering equipment, cigarette smoke curling through the dim light. The war in Europe was nearly over. Berlin was crumbling, Hitler presumed dead or close to it. Yet on that cold April night, a signal arrived that none of them could explain. It was faint, a whisper beneath the noise. But once filtered and stabilized, the room fell silent. The voice on the recording rasped through the static like a ghost clawing through the airwaves. The voice will not die. The shadow weapon, rebirth. Those who will carry my voice. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the senior operator lifted the receiver. Get Washington, now. Within hours, the tape was flown across the channel under armed escort. The courier carried one instruction: deliver only to OSS command, eyes only. At the Office of Strategic Services headquarters in London, Major Alan Kirkwood stared at the decoded transcript spread across his desk. 38 years old, sharp, skeptical and methodical, Kirkwood had built his career on not believing in the extraordinary. Yet this he couldn't dismiss. The report claimed the signal came from within Berlin, transmitted on a frequency that technically didn't exist. The logs confirmed it was picked up in London, intercepted again by the U.S. Signal Corps in Virginia, and triangulated to a range of just a few hundred meters beneath the Reich Chancellery. The timing matched exactly with Hitler's supposed final hours. The British cryptographers had already run an analysis. It wasn't a forgery. The cadence, the tone, the phrasing, it matched Adolf Hitler's confirmed broadcasts. But the content was something else entirely. Kirkwood replayed the audio. The hiss of static filled the room. Then through the noise came that same broken German voice, disjointed, unsteady, yet commanding. The weapon is not fire, not steel. The weapon is the voice. The words carry the will. Germany will live. In the sound, a shiver crept down Kirkwood's spine. This wasn't the ranting of a dying dictator. It sounded almost like an instruction, a directive. He picked up the secure line. Code black transmission confirmed, he told the OSS director. We're initiating analysis under new designation, Operation Echo. Within 48 hours, Operation Echo became one of the most classified projects in Allied intelligence. The team was small. Only 12 men and women chosen from the OSS, Signal Intelligence and British code-breaking units at Bletchley Park. They were sworn to absolute secrecy. The file was labeled Level Red, Restricted Presidential Access. Kirkwood met with the team in a sealed underground room. The walls were lined with maps of Europe, radio frequency charts, and photographs of ruined German transmitters. At the center of the table sat a single reel-to-reel recorder. This, Kirkwood said quietly, was transmitted from Berlin hours before Hitler's reported death. It references something called a shadow weapon. We don't know what that means. We don't know if it's propaganda or something worse. But we will find out. A young linguist, Margaret Lyle, adjusted her glasses. Could it be a coded directive? Maybe to sleeper agents? Possibly, Kirkwood replied. But there's more. The waveform of this broadcast is irregular. It contains modulations that don't match any known transmitter pattern. It's like, he hesitated, it's like something else is embedded beneath the voice. They ran the signal through the latest spectrographic analyzers. The readings made no sense. Frequency spikes beyond human vocal range, tonal patterns that repeated in a rhythmic pulse. It almost looked intentional. Could be layered encryption, said the technician. Or interference, Kirkwood frowned. Then why does it repeat every 4 seconds? It's too consistent to be random. Hours turned into days. They slowed the tape, reversed it, mapped its peaks and troughs. And then, during one playback, they caught something, faint buried under the Führer's words. A second voice, it wasn't clear. Not speech exactly, more like mechanical breathing, synchronized with the recording. The engineers checked the machine. It was fine. The anomaly was on the original tape. Margaret leaned in. Sir, I think this was recorded twice. Once by a human, once by something else. In Washington, word reached the highest levels of government. President Truman, only weeks into office after Roosevelt's sudden death, was briefed on Operation Echo in the early hours of May 7th. The war in Europe was ending, but now he was being told of a broadcast from Hitler's bunker that didn't match any known transmission technology. What are we saying here? Truman asked the intelligence officer. That Hitler spoke from the grave? No, sir, the man replied. We're saying the signal originated from a transmitter that was already destroyed when it aired. The room fell silent. Operation Echo scientists were now convinced the recording contained more than speech. When they isolated frequencies between 16 and 19 kilohertz above human hearing, they found pulse intervals identical to radar signatures. Embedded within Hitler's final words was a coded pattern that looked like a transmission key. But to what? A report from Bletchley Park arrived days later. Possible post-war activation sequence. Correlates with known Nazi research into remote acoustic resonance. Kirkwood didn't like where that was heading. You're suggesting, he said carefully, that this transmission wasn't just words. It was designed to trigger something. The analyst nodded. Maybe not a device. Maybe a response. Kirkwood stared at the tape recorder, its reels still spinning. A response from what? By mid-May, as Europe celebrated victory, Operation Echo was moved into deep storage. The OSS sealed the tapes in a temperature-controlled vault and filed them under a false project name, Psychological Warfare Archive, NUCA 47. Only 2 copies of the audio were ever confirmed. Officially, the transmission never existed. Unofficially, whispers spread among intelligence circles, of a message that could bend the limits of sound, of a voice that didn't die when its speaker did. Kirkwood wrote the final line of his classified report. The transmission known as V13 exhibits unknown acoustic phenomena. It references continuity beyond death and a rebirth through the preservation of the Führer's voice. Further investigation suspended by executive order. Recommend indefinite containment. He sealed the file, locked it in a steel case, and handed it to the courier. Years later, when asked about the war, Kirkwood would only say one thing. There are some voices, he whispered, that were never meant to be heard again, and somewhere, hidden beneath decades of secrecy and dust, the tape kept spinning, the voice repeating its promise through the static. The voice will not die. The shadow weapon rebirth, those who will carry my voice. In the spring of 1946, Europe lay in ruins, its cities broken, its archives cracked open like graves. Allied intelligence units combed through what was left of the Third Reich, pulling secrets from bunkers, vaults, and burnt-out ministries. Crates of film reels, coded documents, and reels of magnetic tape were stacked in endless warehouses under armed guard. Every discovery was catalogued, sorted, and shipped west, to London, Washington, or places that didn't officially exist. One such crate arrived at a U.S. Army Signal Corps depot outside Frankfurt. The label, barely legible beneath soot, read Rundfunkarchiv, Wilhelmstrasse. Inside were half-melted microphones, shattered transmitters, and 2 reels of damaged tape wrapped in a scorched cloth. On the inner cardboard ring of one reel, a faint marking could be seen in pencil. V13, Führer's Directive. The officer overseeing inventory, Lieutenant Harold Pruitt, almost discarded it. The tape was warped, brittle, and reeked of burned plastic, but the label caught his attention. V13, it matched an item, reference he'd seen months earlier in OSS briefings about the so-called echo transmission. He quietly ordered the reel sent to Washington under diplomatic cover. By the time it reached U.S. soil, it was tagged for restricted analysis and handed over to a man named Sergeant Lewis Warren, an audio restoration specialist with the Army Signal Corps. Warren was known for resurrecting destroyed recordings, wire spools recovered from submarines, black box data from crashed bombers, even propaganda broadcasts burned in retreating Nazi stations. But this, the officers told him, was different. He was instructed to work alone behind locked doors. No copies, no playback outside the lab.
Warren began by examining the tape's surface. Half of it was fused together, but the other half, though warped, was still magnetic. He carefully rewound it by hand, muttering to himself as he marked the damaged sections. Weird patterning here, he noted in his log. Some kind of modulation error, not just sound. When he finally played the first restored seconds, the speakers emitted a low hum, deep, rhythmic, almost biological. Then, faintly beneath the noise, came speech. German. It was unmistakably Hitler's voice, though cracked, halting, broken by bursts of interference. Warren increased the gain, trying to isolate the frequencies. What he heard next stopped him cold. The voice began to split. As the tape unspooled, it alternated. One moment human, the next metallic, hollow, reverberating with an unnatural timbre. Words blurred into distortion, like a machine trying to imitate a man. He replayed it, slower this time. The pattern became clear. Every few seconds the voice repeated itself, slightly altered, layered beneath the original. It was as if the speaker's words were being echoed by something else. Warren's notes that day were brief, shaky. Voice modulation not consistent with human laryngeal range. Possible synthetic overlay. Frequency between 17 to 19 kHz. Feels alive. He didn't play it again for several hours. When he did, the recording grew even stranger. Midway through the reel, the interference cleared briefly, and the voice, calm, deliberate, said, "When the silence ends, my words shall return. Germany will speak again." Then the tape screeched violently, snapping off the spool. The room's fluorescent lights flickered, and every piece of equipment in the lab shut down. Warren sat frozen in the dark, the last echo of the voice still hanging in the air like static. 3 days later, Sergeant Lewis Warren was found dead in his apartment. His service pistol lay on the floor beside him, 1 bullet fired. The official report read, suicide, but the details didn't add up. There was no note. His neighbors said he'd been cheerful, even excited, about what he'd uncovered. On his desk, investigators found his restoration logs, but the final page had been torn out. The only remaining clue was a small envelope tucked into his jacket pocket. Inside was a scrap of recording paper with a single phrase scrawled in ink. "It's not just his voice." The reel was immediately seized by military intelligence and reclassified. A copy was sent to the newly formed Central Intelligence Group, the precursor to the CIA, for archival containment. The other was stored in a vault at Fort Meade under project name V13. Directive. Access required presidential authorization. In the following weeks, strange reports circulated through the Signal Corps. Technicians claimed the equipment from Warren's lab still malfunctioned, even after being replaced. Oscilloscopes displayed spontaneous waveforms when left idle. Some swore they heard faint whispering when they stood near the playback devices, though no power was connected. One night, a security officer walking the corridor past the sealed storage room heard a faint hiss through the steel door, like radio static. He put his ear closer. Through the noise, he thought he heard a voice. A man's voice. Speaking in German, he filed a report. 2 days later, the storage room was emptied. Everything inside, the tapes, the logs, the equipment, vanished without record of transfer. Months later, A classified memorandum circulated between the OSS and the Department of War. It read simply, Subject, Artifact V13, Recommendation for Indefinite Restriction. Contents believed to include experimental transmission recorded April 1945, Berlin. Origin unknown. Effects on auditory equipment anomalous. All future handling to require presence of medical officer. Status sealed. Storage site undisclosed. And that was the end of it, at least officially. But among a handful of intelligence officers who'd been there, the rumors never stopped. They said Warren hadn't died from guilt or exhaustion. They said he'd played the recording one last time, alone, and that for a few seconds before he pulled the trigger, he'd begun speaking in German. The tape was never heard again. Yet decades later, engineers in certain classified facilities would occasionally report odd interference, short bursts of static appearing on secure frequencies, always repeating a single line, when the silence ends, my words shall return. No one could trace the signal. No one could explain how it appeared. But somewhere, deep beneath layers of classified archives, a single tape sits locked in a metal case marked with two words that no one dares to play again. V13, Führer's Directive, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1963. The Cold War hums in the background of everyday life. Satellites orbiting above, spies whispering in the shadows, scientists racing to decode the future. In the quiet basement of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Acoustics Research Laboratory, a young researcher named Dr. Harold Whitman spends his nights surrounded by reels of magnetic tape and the hum of experimental computers. He's 32, brilliant, and obsessive, a man whose curiosity often crosses the line between genius and danger. Whitman's focus is the physics of sound, how frequency and pattern affect the human brain. His recent grant from the U.S. Air Force funds research into psychological resonance, exploring whether audio signals can alter perception or emotion. It's pure science, until he finds a folder he shouldn't have. It happens one evening while reviewing archived OSS recordings for his project. Most are mundane, intercepted Nazi broadcasts, test signals, coded radio chatter. But one listing makes him pause. The reel's ID number reads V13, Führer's Directive. At first he assumes it's another propaganda speech. But the metadata seems odd. Restricted, presidential access only. The classification has been partially lifted, thanks to a bureaucratic oversight during declassification of post-war intelligence. Whitman's eyes narrow. V13, he murmurs. Why does that sound familiar? He spends the next 2 nights digging through the MIT archives, tracing references to OSS Project Echo. Every mention ends abruptly, pages blacked out, citations missing. Yet one internal memo from 1946 catches his attention. Artifact exhibits irregular frequency bands beyond human speech. Recommend containment. Effects unpredictable. Whitman's pulse quickens. He drafts a formal request to the National Archives, claiming he's researching historical resonance distortion in early broadcast recordings. Weeks later, a courier delivers a sealed box containing one magnetic reel and a faded document marked Property of U.S. Signal Corps, V13 Directive. Handle with care. That night, Whitman sets up his equipment. The lab is silent except for the low hum of machines and the whir of an oscillograph. He threads the tape carefully onto a restored playback deck, switches on the monitor, and adjusts the gain. At first, there's only static, a hiss that seems to pulse rhythmically, almost like breathing. Then a voice fades in, deep and hoarse, echoing across 20 years of silence. It's unmistakably Hitler, or something trying to sound like him. The weapon is the voice. When the silence ends, the will returns. Whitman leans closer, adjusting frequency filters. But then his screen shows something strange, patterns that shouldn't exist. The amplitude graph reveals secondary signals buried beneath the speech, pulsing in structured bursts. He runs it again. The pattern repeats, evenly spaced, too precise to be random. He decodes the intervals. It's Morse code. His hands tremble as he scribbles the translation. The embedded message, buried beneath Hitler's final words, reads, Project Lazarus. Continue the voice. Whitman stares at the page, chills crawling up his spine. Lazarus, the man resurrected from death. What could it mean? He replays the tape, now obsessed. This time he slows it by half speed. The background distortion deepens into low, inhuman tones, not electronic interference, but something that modulates. The pitch fluctuates like breath, like something alive inside the sound. Suddenly, the speakers emit a piercing shriek. The lights in the lab flicker. Instruments spike off the charts. Whitman rips off his headphones, heart pounding. The sound fades, but on his monitor, the spectrograph continues to draw lines, even though the tape has stopped. The machine is still hearing something, he whispers to himself. It's still transmitting. The next morning, Whitman delivers a brief report to his department chair, claiming he's detected non-human audio interference within the recording. His supervisor laughs it off. "Harold, you've been staring at screens too long." But within hours, the Air Force liaison assigned to his lab arrives and quietly removes the tape. Whitman demands to know why. The man simply says, "You were never authorized to access that material." That night, Whitman returns to his lab. The doors are sealed. His key card no longer works. Through the narrow window, he sees the playback deck, gone. The entire workstation dismantled. Someone has erased all evidence of the experiment. He returns home, shaken. But his curiosity won't let go. He rewinds the events in his head, the hidden Morse code, the phrase, Project Lazarus. He digs deeper into classified research files and uncovers a chilling pattern. In the early 1950s, the U.S. Air Force funded something called Project Voice Continuity, allegedly an experiment to simulate Hitler's tone using early computer synthesis. The project was shut down after test subjects reported auditory hallucinations. One memo mentions resonant contagion, the theory that certain frequencies could imprint themselves into the human brain, persisting even after the sound stopped. Whitman realizes the implications.
It could have been designed or evolved to survive. In the months that follow, colleagues notice changes in him. He grows pale, withdrawn, sleepless. He claims to hear faint whispers in the hum of fluorescent lights, murmurs that match the cadence of the recording. His friends dismiss it as exhaustion. But one student recalls walking past Whitman's office late one night and hearing him speaking softly, in fluent German, a language he didn't know. Then, in December 1963, Dr. Harold Whitman vanishes. His car is found parked outside his Cambridge apartment. Inside, his typewriter sits on the desk, a single page still in the roller. On it, one line typed in uneven letters. The voice wasn't human. The case is quietly closed. Voluntary disappearance. The Air Force retrieves his research under sealed order. No one at MIT ever speaks of it again. But years later, in the archives of the Acoustics Research Laboratory, a janitor finds a small reel hidden behind a cabinet. There's no label, just a faint pencil mark, HW. When he hands it over to his supervisor, the man hesitates before locking it away. For just a second before sealing the box, he presses play. The tape hums. A whisper emerges, faint but distinct. Project Lazarus, continue. The voice. He shuts it off immediately, and in the silence that follows, he could swear he still hears breathing, slow, mechanical, and impossibly human, coming from somewhere deep inside the machine. Washington, D.C., 1992. The Soviet Union has fallen. Intelligence agencies across the world are forced to peel back decades of sealed secrets, their hidden files dragged into the cold light of a new era. Inside a vast government records building on the edge of Maryland, a young archivist named Claire Donovan, no relation to the famous OSS director, opens a mislabeled box stamped Property of War Department, 1945. Most of the papers inside are mundane. Troop movement logs, requisition forms, faded photographs of occupied Berlin. But one thin folder stands out. The paper is brittle, the ink faded, but the heading remains legible, Operation Echo, Level Red Memorandum. At the bottom of the page is a signature, scrawled in deep black fountain pen, William J. Donovan, Director OSS. Claire leans closer, reading the first line aloud. An anomalous transmission detected between April 28 to 30, 1945, originating below the Berlin metropolitan grid. Voice identification, probable Adolf Hitler. Her breath catches. Below Berlin? She mutters. That phrase shouldn't exist in any official record. She flips the page. The memo continues in coded language, referencing non-standard frequency resonance and posthumous voice projection experiments. The words don't fit the wartime lexicon. They sound almost modern. Within weeks, word leaks to the press. A minor article appears in a niche intelligence history magazine. OSS file links Hitler to mystery broadcast. April 1945. The piece would have gone unnoticed, if not for the internet. Early online forums light up with speculation. Conspiracy theorists, amateur historians, and audio hobbyists swarm the story, hunting for proof. One forum post claims the broadcast was part of a Nazi spirit radio experiment. Another insists it was a CIA test of synthetic voice technology decades before the digital age. But then someone uploads a grainy scan of the memo, the one Claire found. Its authenticity is undeniable. The document clearly states, transmission classified under Operation Echo, source frequency unidentified. Containment recommended. The story explodes. Television documentaries begin airing late-night specials titled Hitler's Final Message. Scholars dismiss it as Cold War myth-making, yet in the shadows of academia, some researchers take notice. Dr. Lars Neumann, a sound historian from Munich, is among them. Using archived intercept logs from Bletchley Park, he tracks a single frequency spike registered on April 29, 1945, between 3:12 and 3:15 a.m. London time. The signal originated from somewhere deep beneath Berlin's bombed city centre. But here's the problem. No known transmitter existed there. Neumann's report, published quietly in 1993, concludes with a haunting line. If the signal was artificial, it came from nowhere. Around the same time, a second leak hits the media, this time from retired intelligence personnel. A set of heavily redacted CIA papers from the 1950s references vocal replication experiments under MK Naomi, a lesser-known branch of the MK Ultra program. The documents describe Project Resurrect, an early psychological operation using reconstructed enemy voices to induce confusion among foreign troops. One paragraph stands out. Prototype voice modeled on archival source V13. Replication successful at 73% fidelity. Subject reactions unpredictable. The implication sends shockwaves through the research community. Could it be that Hitler's final broadcast was used, copied, synthesized, and tested during the Cold War? Audio engineers begin analyzing what few fragments of the V13 recording still exist. Among them is Eleanor Shaw, a spectral analyst from Los Alamos. She compares the waveform to standard human speech and freezes when she sees the results. Human voices, no matter how deep or distorted, follow organic curves, complex but continuous. The V13 waveform, however, displays geometric regularity, like architecture rather than anatomy. Perfect squares, symmetrical intervals. The pattern repeats with machine precision. Shaw's summary, later cited in a 1994 symposium, reads, "The signal shows characteristics of algorithmic modulation. It was either artificially constructed or not entirely human." When she presents her findings at a small conference in Virginia, a man in a dark suit approaches her afterward. "You've done impressive work," he says quietly. "But it's best if you stop digging. Some voices should stay buried." She never sees him again. Meanwhile, in the corners of the early web, theories spiral out of control. Some claim the voice was never human at all, that Hitler's last message was created by Nazi scientists experimenting with frequency-based mind control. Others suggest the US captured the signal and weaponized it, embedding subsonic patterns into Cold War propaganda broadcasts. But then, something eerie happens. An anonymous user uploads a short audio clip, allegedly from the declassified V13 reel. It's barely 2 seconds long, static, a low hum, then a whisper. Linguists debate the phrase endlessly, but most agree on one chilling interpretation: "Wir werden zurückkehren." We will return. The clip is analyzed, debunked, reanalyzed. yet no one can prove where it came from. The waveform matches no known digital generation pattern. It isn't a recording artifact. It's something else. Back in Washington, Claire Donovan is quietly reassigned. When she returns to the archive months later, the box she found, the one labeled Operation Echo, is gone. A single sheet of paper remains in its place, file relocated, classification reinstated under Department of Defense, 1993. She never hears of it again. But sometimes, when working late at night, she swears she hears faint static coming from the facility's intercom, just a brief hiss, followed by silence. By the end of the 1990s, the story of Hitler's final broadcast has become an urban legend, a dark footnote whispered by intelligence historians and conspiracy buffs alike. Yet those who've heard the surviving audio all say the same thing. There's something wrong about the sound, not just its tone or distortion, but the way it seems to linger, like it's waiting for a reply, and somewhere, deep in a classified vault beneath Washington, the original V-13 reel still sits, silent, sealed, and perfectly preserved, until someone presses play again, deep beneath the National Archives in Washington. Behind biometric locks and soundproofed steel doors sits a temperature-controlled vault. Inside, amid relics of the past, coded telegrams, Cold War recordings, fragments of destroyed nations, lies a single metal canister. Its label reads, Audio Artifact 317B, Restricted Access. The canister contains what remains of the V-13 reel, the recording that has haunted intelligence agencies for nearly 8 decades. Fewer than a dozen people in the world are said to have heard it. Those who don't speak publicly, but whispers have always found their way out. A former technician described it as the sound of a man speaking from nowhere. Others called it unnatural, claiming that when the recording plays, the air in the room seems to thicken, as if sound itself bends under a weight you can't see. Unofficial reports mention physical side effects, nausea, vertigo, blurred vision, and in one case, temporary hearing loss. A researcher allegedly suffered a seizure midway through playback, mumbling fragments of German long after the recording stopped. Another claimed the voice didn't just echo through the speakers, it seemed to echo inside his skull. When questioned, he said something that sent chills through his supervisor. It wasn't Hitler I heard. It was something using him. Every few years, renewed efforts emerged to declassify the tape. Freedom of information requests, journalistic investigations, even Senate inquiries. Each time, the answer is the same. Information withheld under National Security Directive. Yet despite the secrecy, copies or echoes seem to surface. A digital spectrogram, posted anonymously in 2019, bore unmistakable similarities to the waveform of the V-13 fragment analyzed decades earlier. No one knows who uploaded it. But when audio experts tried to isolate its frequencies, their systems crashed. Still, the question remains, what was the recording? A desperate dictator's final words? A psychological experiment gone wrong? Or something more? Something born in the static between man and machine, between faith and madness? One truth lingers through the fog of speculation. Someone wanted the voice to survive, and somehow it did. The camera drifts through the darkened archive corridor, the hum of fluorescent lights fading into silence. A single red light blinks above the vault door. Recording, the narrator's voice returns, low and steady. Perhaps the war never truly ended. Perhaps the voice that began it was never meant to die. The screen fades to black. Then, through the static, faint but unmistakable, a voice whispers in broken, distorted German, "Wir sind noch hier." We are still here. The static deepens, then silence.